Kate Cherrell, and I just want to extend our congratulations again on behalf of ASSAP for your graduation yesterday.
Thank you.
Well done. That was fantastic. I know you've had it for a long time, but to have the ceremony was brilliant. So we're really happy for you. So Dr. Kate Cherrell is a writer, lecturer, and speaker specializing in 19th century spiritualism. She is the creator and editor of burialsandbeyond.com, a website which seeks to make death, social, and paranormal history accessible to a wider audience. She can currently be seen co-presenting the television show Jack Osborne's Haunted Homecoming on Discovery since January 2022. And she also co-presents Loopholes, an ongoing discussion podcast about the paranormal and the unexplained. She maintains an interest in paranormal investigation, cemeteries, Victoriana, and good wine. Good girl yourself. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, really looking forward to this talk on Scratching Fanny of Cock Lane. Over to you, Dr. Cherrell.
Right, well, thank you very much. And I definitely didn't pick this topic because I'm impressively immature. So before we get going, I'm probably going to speak to you for about 45 minutes. And I just wanted to put up a quick little content warning, just in case of these things, that I will be touching on child death a couple of times. But yeah, let's get going. So firstly, thank you very much for having me to talk to you again this evening. As they said, my name's Kate Cherrell, and I periodically obsess over historical hauntings, as I'm sure many of you do too. Now, tonight's talk isn't a finished paper or a project as such, more of a work in progress that I'm excited to share with like-minded people. Tonight I'd like to talk about the pleasantly named Cock Lane ghost. And this isn't overly academic or a dense sociological. Can we also, I'm so sorry, can we also make sure that our microphones are muted, because I am hopelessly distracted by bright colours and sounds like magpies and tiny dogs. That's all right. Cheers. And if anyone else doesn't know how to do it, would someone mind just...
Yeah, I'm going through now.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry about that. So yes, this isn't overly academic. It isn't a finished project. This is kind of a love letter to Scratching Fanny, a phrase that I've never said before, and I'm finally pleased to get that out of my system. So this is more a thorough look through one of England's most famous and infamous hauntings. Now, the story of the Cock Lane ghost isn't just a simple supernatural story, and it's not just a report of a ghost, you know, a bit of tapping, then the mysterious disappearance of the troublesome spirit. It's something much larger. It's a ghost story, and there are knocks and taps, but it's also a warning from the past about media manipulation, about witch hunts, and the dreaded fake news. And by examining the story of the Cock Lane ghost, we not only unfurl the story of a haunting that gripped England, but a story of betrayal, love, death, debt, and gin. And let's be truthful here, it really is an opportunity for me to say the word cock repeatedly in front of a group of strangers with little to no repercussion. So what is the story of the Cock Lane ghost? Well, before we get into the nitty-gritty, an abridged summary is as follows. So, man marries woman, woman dies. Man has hots for dead woman's sister. Sister returns hots. They can't marry. They move to London. They meet a nice landlord. Man lends money to landlord. Sister dies. Money isn't getting repaid. Landlord refuses to pay. Says man one is a murderer and a ghost told him so. London goes wild. And as you can tell, no, I do not have an art degree. So why is this silly and admittedly quite sad story so important to us today? Well, by looking at the full picture of the Cock Lane ghost, we're able to glean so much about active paranormal investigation today, and we can find guidance in investigative methodologies, the inherent flaws in many commonly used practices, and more human-centric issues that often fall by the wayside when we're in the midst of an active contemporary investigation. Now, of course, the Cock Lane ghost does not only inform those of us who participate in paranormal investigations, but demonstrates common and unexpected methods of deception and of suggestion and susceptibility, meaning that we can not only be fooled by others who feign both innocence and authority, but fooled by ourselves and our own consciousness, which so often seeks to find meaning in chaos. Sociologically speaking, elements of the Cock Lane ghost story show how societal and cultural prejudices can be manipulated for the benefit of others. It also reinforces the importance of healthy and unbiased skepticism in matters of the supernatural and fantastical. A simple line of skeptical or critical inquiry can only help to strengthen the legitimacy of investigations or the legitimacy of purported cases of hauntings and anomalous phenomena. Historically speaking, the story of the Cock Lane ghost demonstrates forms of pre-spiritualist spirit contact, with call and response rappings shown to be long-established means of supernatural communication. Similarly, by looking closer at the ghost's earthbound catalyst or medium, we can interrogate notions of the monstrous feminine and the inherent gendered power of the prepubescent child medium. So there we go. So much that we know of the Cock Lane haunting is apocryphal by nature. Due to the age and the sensationalist coverage of events, there were no thorough records of scientific, or what was regarded as scientific, investigative methods. At most, we could say that today we rely on religious or faith-based interpretations in order to understand the full scope of the Cock Lane incident. Similarly, later controversies that we'll touch on have been put forward by those without medical or scientific training. In one instance, the individual's artistic background is upheld as a means to validate his medical and scientific claims of how bodies react and decay. In short, there are many tales from the 18th to 19th centuries that latch onto the Cock Lane story like a barnacle. But really, the Cock Lane ghost is an episode of Jeremy Kyle, where clashing personalities are framed as players in some great supernatural drama, rather than victims and villains in a simple case of love, grief, and financial exploitation. It really is one hell of a story, and in the age of churning, relentless conspiracy theorists and calls of manipulation and fake news, it's a story that can teach us a lot. Learning from the past really is a necessity, even if it is through a ghost. So the story of the Cock Lane ghost begins in 1756, far outside of London, in Stoke Ferry, Norfolk. William Kent married Elizabeth Lynes, who was the daughter of a greengrocer. Now, while the happy couple seemed quite content with their nuptials, Elizabeth's family were not so smitten. This may have been because of William's dealings as a moneylender, or perhaps he was just an unpleasant man. But the family's dislike of Kent was not enough to stop the wedding. Afterwards, William and Elizabeth packed their bags and relocated to help run an inn elsewhere in Norfolk, hoping to start a family of their own. Tragically, their days of alehouse-based bliss were not to last. Elizabeth had become pregnant very quickly and carried the pregnancy to full term. However, during delivery, the young mother died. Most commonly, this may have been from a condition called childbed fever or puerperal fever. I'm sure some medical professionals around you will be wincing at that pronunciation, being an infection of the uterus. Now, death in childbirth wasn't too uncommon at the time, as maternal mortality rates were particularly high. Also, bacterial infections were high during this period due to poor understandings of hygiene and disease control. Estimates of maternal mortality in the late 18th century state that unassisted women in childbirth died at a rate of 25 in every 1,000. Some estimates cite around 29 in every 1,000, or as low as 5, but only in cases when professional obstetricians were in attendance. Now, during the pregnancy, Elizabeth's sister Fanny had moved in with the couple to help assist them as the due date crept ever closer. And following Elizabeth's death, Fanny stayed with the widower, helping to care for his newborn son. Sadly, tragedy was to strike again as 2 months later, William's son died, leaving him bereft. But during the period of Fanny's stay, the two had grown closer in their shared grief, and they ultimately fell in love. And while this in itself would seem unpleasant or inappropriate to the family, even in today's eyes, In the late 18th century, it was a legal impossibility for the two to seal their union in marriage. Because William had married Fanny's sister, and that union had resulted in a child, albeit a now deceased child, but a child nonetheless, under canon law, being the law of the Church of England, it was illegal for the two to marry. Now, this suited the Lynes family, like Fanny's family, just fine, as having lost one daughter, they weren't too keen to lose another to William Kent's affections. So, in January 1759, William Kent relocated to London to try and set the groundwork for a better life for the couple. In his absence, Fanny wrote relentless and effusive letters professing her undying love and affection, an affection that was, I quote, not to be stifled or eradicated from her breast. Now, these letters are worth noting, as their existence is recorded in legal proceedings, as this proof of affection was later needed by authorities. With no wedding band, but such affection between the two, Fanny's arrival in London was inevitable. And after William's visits to and from his love, it transpires that she arrived at the capital while 4 months pregnant. William was keen to house them somewhere comfortable, and even more so now that Fanny was pregnant, but his planned accommodation was not yet ready for them to inhabit. Instead, the eloping couple reunited in London, believing that something would suit their needs, and perhaps if they just prayed. So the pair went to a service at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is also known as St. Sepulchre without Newgate, in Holborn, which is still standing today. Now, it was built on Saxon foundations, partially destroyed by the Great Fire of London, and was expanded and altered ever since. But most impressively of all, it survived the 1970s town planners that decimated so many of the sites in this story. Now, after the service, William and Fanny, who were introducing themselves as a married couple, got talking with the parish clerk, Richard Parsons. They explained their plight and their desperation for temporary accommodation, and Parsons stepped in to rescue the desperate couple, all out of the goodness of his Christian heart. Or so it seemed. Parsons had a spare room to let at his house in Cock Lane, and soon enough the young couple dragged their bags across Holborn and into the property at 25 Cock Lane. Now, at first, Parsons and Kent got on very well, and the friendship between the men blossomed. Rather quickly, William agreed to lend his new landlord 12 guineas, which is approximately £1,300 in today's money, or about 215 days' wages of a skilled tradesman. Now, it was no small chunk of cash at all, even for a moneylender, and an incredibly generous gesture. But Parsons was a godly man and a parish clerk, so he could be trusted to be a good debtor, couldn't he? Hardly. Richard Parsons was constantly in debt and was an utterly awful debtor. His stipend was meagre at best, and what he did earn was soon frittered away in many of the gin houses that thrived in every back street in London. In short, Parsons was a manipulator, a liar, and an alcoholic, but he wasn't the only one at this time. And if we take a closer look at the alcohol culture of the capital in the 18th century, the landscape of the Cock Lane ghost really does come to life in all of its grimy glory. Now, in the 17th and 18th centuries, gin and beer were incredibly cheap, as production of alcohol was uncontrolled by any official body. In short, anyone could set up their own pseudo-distillery and sell incredibly strong alcohol to passers-by. Cheap alcohol was sold in enormous volumes and was a thriving industry, as the poor, the vulnerable and downtrodden in society could drown their sorrows or make merriment for just a few pennies. Some of us will be familiar with the phrase, drunk for a penny, blind drunk for twopence. In some boroughs, there were over 7,000 separate gin shops crammed into a small shopping district. To put it into even greater perspective, in a district such as St Giles in the borough of Camden, 1 in every 4 buildings was associated with the production or the sale of gin. Gin was seen by many as the country's greatest evil and threat to health, morality and well-being. Most importantly, it was believed to be one of the primary causes of crime in the City of London. Now, after many years of campaigning, Parliament finally stepped in and developed the Gin Act of 1751, meaning that the number of gin shops around the country was greatly reduced. There had been ferocious campaigning for the regulation of alcohol for decades, and gin was blamed by many as causing the downfall of society, being mother's ruin, as my granny used to tell me, and a sign of an increasingly godless world. Now, some of the most famous creative interpretations of this time in Britain's history can be seen in Hogarth's etchings on screen here of Gin Lane and Beer Street, which were published as a pair in 1751. And to the one on the left in Gin Lane, that's where we get a lot of our mother's ruin ideas, with a drunken, inebriated mother letting her baby fall over a rail. Now, these were produced as moralistic campaign pieces and were widely reproduced in the push against the unregulated production and sale of gin. And for the Hogarths of this world, the temperance movement and sober authorities, their successful campaign was seen as a triumph. Now, the Sale of Spirits Act 1750, or the Gin Act of 1751, ultimately reduced the consumption of all distilled spirits by preventing gin distillers from selling to unlicensed merchants and by adding fees or proto-taxes to merchants themselves. Now, in doing so, the small gin shops and gin sellers that people such as Parsons depended upon had to close. Now, while gin was still available from large distilleries and retailers, the price hikes were really substantial. Now, this was a mere inconvenience to most recreational drinkers, but to those who were alcohol dependent, such as Richard Parsons, it could have seemed like a death sentence. London was a city of alcoholics who still needed the gin, but at triple the price. So back at Cock Lane, Parsons had to support his wife, his children, and his alcohol addiction. So it was no wonder, really, that he was so keen to take in a lodger, especially one so keen to part with his money. Now, Parsons was, I find, quite a strange man. He had alcohol, faith, and death at the centre of his day. He spent most nights drinking at the Wheatsheaf Tavern and running administrative errands between the nearby Holy Sepulchre Church and Newgate Prison. One of his obligations as parish clerk and bellman was a morbid one, often left out of recollections of the Cock Lane story. Now, when anyone was condemned to death at Newgate Prison, Parsons would be expected to walk there, commonly from the pub, ring his bell and recite set words, including poetry, to those due to be executed the next day. Now, this was a form of friendly, cheerful, and quite frankly, utterly pointless advice for those about to die. Now, this had been an expectation of the parish clerk since about 1605, and the established recitations had changed very little since then. Now, this role helped to heighten Parsons' status as a moral linchpin, really, of the local community, a truthful, godly, and just man who ministered to those just about to meet their maker. Now, the speech began, "You prisoners that are within for wickedness and sin, after many mercies shown you, are now appointed to die tomorrow in the forenoon." Now, the full text is on the screen if you want to screenshot it and recite it to your loved ones later tonight. And don't worry, I won't be reading out the whole thing. So, in 1759, while Richard was spending his days with gin, God, and the gallows, William and a heavily pregnant Fanny were living in a small room at 25 Cock Lane. While William was out at work or on business in Norfolk, Fanny was not short of company. Parsons' 11-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, known as Betty, was a, I quote, little artful girl, and would spend much of her day with Fanny. And when she was absent, a maidservant called Esther was working in the house. Now, Esther was affectionately known as Carrots due to her fiery red hair, and by all accounts, she had a really great relationship with Fanny, with the two becoming friends, or friends as best as an employer and servant can be. And this is water, not gin, by the way. I've got a very sore throat. Now, one night, while Parsons was alone at Cock Lane, he looked to the stairs and was terrified by what he saw. A ghostly figure in white was ascending the staircase, moving towards the couple's bedroom. Another night, shortly thereafter, Fanny and Betty spent the night in bed together, with the child keeping the heavily pregnant woman company. But it was not to be a peaceful night. Throughout the night and into the early hours, they were frightened and kept awake by relentless knocks and scratching noises that only stopped at daybreak. Now, as Fanny neared the final months of her pregnancy, the couple were finally able to move out of their temporary accommodation at Cock Lane and into what was supposed to be something more permanent. But after all of their waiting and torment, marital bliss was not to be. In the last stretch of her pregnancy, Fanny contracted smallpox. Now, at this time, this could have been a fatal and incurable diagnosis. She was treated by 2 separate doctors who tried to save her. One of them tried by bleeding her on several occasions in a fruitless attempt to remove the virus from her body. Sadly, Fanny died, and died before giving birth. William was distraught and couldn't believe that happiness had been snatched from him yet again. And when Fanny was laid to rest in St. John's Crypt in Clerkenwell, both the coffin and the burial register were marked with her common law name, if not her legal one, Mrs. Frances Kent. And in the burial ledger here, they've even added Cock Lane Ghost in brackets, so we know that it was her. Shortly before she died, Fanny had drawn up a will that left the majority of her not insubstantial estate to William Kent, leaving just half a crown to each of her remaining siblings. Chance, maybe. Coincidence, perhaps. But even to modern eyes, this would be a little suspicious, a will and a convenient death. But after Fanny's family, that's a mouthful, learned of her death and the existence of the will, they were unsurprisingly furious and contested its contents immediately. Now, what followed was a long and drawn-out legal battle that only compounded the family's hatred and suspicion of William. This hatred would later reach fever pitch as he remarried once more while these legal issues were still ongoing, but that's of little concern to the ghost. At this point, 12 guineas was all that tied William Kent to Cock Lane, and he hoped that his once pleasant landlord would come good on their terms and repay the loan. Instead, Parsons revealed that he knew of William's dark little secret, that he and Fanny had not actually been married and were living in sin. And by revealing this knowledge, he presumed that William would rather write off the debt and save his reputation, rather than pursue the loan and have his dirty secret revealed to the public. Parsons tried different tacks. He even told Kent that he'd already repaid the money in full, and the grieving widower was simply chancing his arm, or was just simply forgetful. Instead, William Kent had him arrested, and in January 1762, he found himself in court, sued for the outstanding balance. Parsons didn't have the money. He needed a miracle or a ghost. And rather conveniently, in the middle of Parsons' legal trouble, the raps and scratches at Cock Lane started up once more fearsome than ever. And these noises seemed to follow the young Betty Parsons, as though they were desperately trying to communicate with her alone. The Parsons family had their concerns and their theories about the noises. Was it a ghost? Was it Fanny's ghost? Betty certainly thought so, and the family brought a handful of friends into the property to try and ascertain the source of the noises, all with little success. But Parsons knew where to find help: the church. And Parsons brought in John Moore, who was a Methodist preacher and rector of St. Bartholomew the Great in Smithfield. And if you ever plan to do a Cock Lane-based tour of London one day, as I have, spoiler, it's a very short tour, it's about 3 streets. There we go. There's me being a delightful tourist on one of my days out. This church is still standing. St. Bartholomew's is a stunning and deceptively large church next to St. Bart's Hospital. It was founded in 1123 and now houses many lunchtime concerts, a tiny gift shop, and a massive gold effigy of a man carrying his own skin, as we'll see here. But that'll be the artwork Exquisite Pain by Damien Hirst, which depicts St. Bartholomew in one of his traditional poses, carrying his own skin as he'd been flayed over his arm, and he's also holding a gold scalpel for good measure. So Parsons approached John Moore for advice on what to do with this scratching situation. Now, after learning of the full circumstances of Kent's life and loves, they came to the conclusion that the noises made within the house were probably a ghost, and probably that of Francis Kent. Enter Scratching Fanny. The pair and Betty decided that they needed to establish a means of communicating with the spirit so they could identify both its identity and its intentions. Now, the code on which they settled is a very familiar one to most of us. And it's often attributed as beginning with the Fox sisters and the Rochester rappings nearly a century later. But it was a simple code. 1 knock for yes, 2 knocks for no. Are you the spirit of Fanny? 1 knock. Did William kill you? 1 knock. Now, why would Parsons ask such a question when she quite publicly, and under the watch of doctors, died of smallpox? But with more open-ended questions, the call and response knock system left a lot to be desired. But with Betty as the spirit's focus, and with a growing audience of interested associates, they continued to pose questions in order to discern William's method of murdering Fanny. So they presented the ghost with a long list of options. All it had to do was knock or scratch when they mentioned the correct method. A little while later, after a veritable shopping list of murder options, one option was given a clear and affirmative response. Fanny had not died of smallpox, but of arsenic poisoning, administered by Kent himself. Now, word of the Cock Lane ghost spread quickly, undoubtedly aided by Parsons. What began as a curiosity for friends and neighbours soon became a citywide obsession. Early on in Parsons' claims, the London press caught wind, or was told, of the Cock Lane ghost, and went on to excitedly document every single development and report for over 6 months. In the meantime, excitable passers-by came to Cock Lane in droves, often in such large crowds that the already narrow street was nigh impassable. Everyone wanted to see the house on Cock Lane, and to be let inside to watch the communications, well, the very thought of it excited Londoners like nothing else. And with the gathering crowds, Parsons realised something very quickly. Ghosts were big money. Parsons went on to turn the ghost of so-called Scratching Fanny into a private commercial enterprise, charging a modest admission fee to anyone who wanted to enter the house and communicate with the spirit. Of course, as with many mediumship groups and ghost hunters today, there were strict environmental requirements for any spectral consultation. Most importantly, if the room was lit by any more than a flickering candle, the ghost would not communicate. Otherwise, Fanny was pretty chatty and very keen to talk, especially about the murder. However, any questions concerning her life before she moved to Cock Lane were answered incorrectly and were simply met with silence. Nonetheless, the crowds kept coming, with many travelling from further afield, to simply be in the presence of the now infamous ghost. And soon enough, the great and good of the 18th century society were taking a trip to Cock Lane, with famous visitors including Horace Walpole, whose novella The Castle of Otranto is regarded as the first Gothic novel, and Prince Edward, who was King George III's brother. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the seances at Cock Lane were particularly impressive, nor were they especially convincing. Now, instead of a more familiar table seance, Fanny would make herself known while Betty was sometimes in bed. She would sometimes be alone, sometimes with a younger sister. Now, regardless of the company she was in, Betty's arms, in the bed instances, had to be under the covers for successful communication. For the seance to begin, there were no hymns or prayers like in 19th century spiritualism. But a relative of the Parsons family, Mary Fraser, would run around the room addressing the spirit in a frantic voice. She would call the spirit simply by yelling, "Fanny, Fanny, why don't you come? Do come, pray Fanny, come, dear Fanny, come." Now, it's not inspiring, but it worked. And after a few rounds, Fanny would make herself known by producing scratching or knocking sounds from the bed frame. And much like the Fox sisters with their feet on pillows, Fanny would be rather reticent to communicate if Betty had her hands fully visible at any of these seances. Now, while this fantastical ghostly story gripped Londoners' minds, William Kent was largely clueless that he was being painted as a murderer, all thanks to his dead wife's scratches. But he would eventually find out after reading a copy of the public ledger, where Fanny, the Cock Lane ghost, was poisoned by a not so subtly named Mr. K. But what gave a lot of weight to the story and the legitimacy of the ghost was the impassioned involvement of people with status, particularly the clergy. Now, Methodist preacher John Moore's public presence for much of the Cock Lane case was public knowledge and reported widely in the press. Now, Methodist ministers, especially in the Smithfield area of London, were greatly respected and held considerable authority, and were certainly not seen to be foolish people. A respected figure in Methodism claiming that ghosts walked among us was broadly accepted at the time, and no great shock during this period, as belief in ghosts being earthbound souls was more rife in Methodism than in Anglican beliefs. This acceptability of the spectral in Methodism was also compounded by the equally well-publicised haunting of Epworth Old Rectory, which happened a few years earlier in 1716. In the case of the Wesley poltergeist, the Reverend Samuel Wesley, his wife, and his 19 children were plagued by poltergeist activity for around a month, where the ghost, which was nicknamed Old Geoffrey, would rattle and thunder in every room, even blowing an invisible horn at deafening decibels. Now, this case would be forever linked with Methodism, as one of Samuel's children, John Wesley, would go on to be the founder of Methodism itself. Now, both poltergeists at Epworth and Cock Lane focused primarily on auditory phenomena rather than manifestations. But in the case of the Wesley poltergeist, if you're not aware, I'm sure most of you will be, the abridged story is as follows. So following a toast to William III and a prayer, Samuel's wife didn't say Amen and refused to do so as she believed that the king, who was the head of the Anglican Church by extension, was a usurper. Now, Samuel was furious and vowed not to have anything to do with her. However, he soon returned, thus breaking his vow. And he believed that the breaking of this vow caused God to send spirits to teach the Wesleys a lesson. So it's unsurprising, really, that Moore and other Methodists believed in ghosts as moralistic teachers and also a form of divine intervention. And Moore had taken up the case of the Cock Lane ghost as a quest of sorts and pushed the narrative that the murderous Mr. K should be hanged for his crimes. Now, eventually, William Kent was persuaded to visit Cock Lane. The séance was sure to be explosive. After all, would Fanny accuse him? An audience had gathered, and there was barely time to breathe before John Moore asked the spirit, "Is the murderer here?" The answer to which was an enormous affirmative bang. Excited by the drama, a member of the audience exclaimed, "Kent, ask this ghost if thou shall be hanged." The ghost's singular bang of yes was clear. Now, William couldn't help but lash out and yell, "Thou art a lying spirit. Thou art not the ghost of my Fanny. She would never have said such a thing." And the once devoted maidservant with the flaming red hair also asked if she and Fanny had ever had a disagreement to test the ghost. And the ghost stated that they had, and the poor maid was equally as enraged at this falsehood. I find it particularly interesting at this point that anyone interrogating the ghost, as particularly Kent himself, they don't question if the ghost is real. They question the identity of the ghost, not the legitimacy of it. But in this instance, more details of the murder were sought. The crowd in front of William asked how the arsenic was administered, giving several options to the spirit, including in beer, in pearl, which was a mix of spices, water, and gin. Again, that little gin undercurrent coming through all of this, or water. And the spirit was clear that the arsenic had been secreted in beer. And that was until William insisted that Fanny had never drunk a glass of beer in her life. And so in frustration, John Moore rephrased the question, and the ghost changed its mind. It was definitely administered in pearl, definitely. And the baying crowd took this and they were calling for William's arrest. Now, William, who before this had been watching the hysteria from afar, began to gather supporters, and set to disproving the ghost's existence. Now, to face off against Moore, he enlisted the help of Stephen Aldrich, who was the rector at St. John's at Clerkenwell and attended to the real-life Fanny on her deathbed. And both clergymen took their side of the Cock Lane ghost story to Samuel Fludyer, who was the mayor of London. Both were calling for legal intervention and the prosecution of the criminal side. Now, for Moore, this was obvious. The criminal side was William Kent, the murderer, and for Aldrich, it was Parsons, a fraud and a maker of false accusations. The mayor dismissed both claims, citing a lack of evidence, but did not renege on his interest in the case. The ghost had to be put to rest somehow. The crowds at Cock Lane had continued to grow, and such enormous gatherings terrified authorities, as with no real established police force at the time, baying crowds could easily become a violent mob. The mayor decided to take up one of Aldrich's suggestions in the end and have young Betty Parsons removed from the house at Cock Lane and placed into the care of ladies of good repute, who would hopefully be able to discern if she, rather than the ghost, was the cause of the noises. Parsons resisted the proposal as best as he could and took out his frustrations in public statements within periodicals and newspapers, a technique that was soon employed by both sides. Now, indeed, heated and personal arguments as to the legitimacy of ghosts and mediums were carried out between parties via letters in periodicals long into the 19th century and the heyday of spiritualism. And if you want to read some real slagging matches between parties, if you look up the Samuel Guppy letters in The Spiritualist, they make for fantastic, trashy reading. However, Betty didn't last long at this first house. Like many people, the family that she was staying with believed in the ghost and didn't want it following them into their household, and they were terrified as a result. The crowds also followed the young child and were bringing undue and unwelcome attention to the Bray family, who took her in. Now, in 1762, Aldrich had assembled a crack team of men of standing to investigate the Cock Lane ghost once and for all. Now, I think the lineup of Aldrich's team reads a bit like an 18th century Ocean's 11. So here's our cast. There was an unnamed physician. There was Dr. Samuel Johnson, who we'll know as the author of the first dictionary, who would ultimately write up the final accounts for the press. Dr. John Douglas, who was a priest with a Poirot-like interest in mysteries and fraud. There was James Penn, a personal friend of Aldrich and lecturer at St. Anne's Church in Aldersgate, and Captain John Wilkinson, who, quite frankly, sounds unhinged, as he once attended a séance armed with a pistol, determined to shoot the ghost should it appear, and the second Earl of Dartmouth, whose primary concern was the negative press that the Methodist movement may have been attracting through the Cock Lane stories. Now, the men had a two-pronged attack planned. They would inspect Betty and they would inspect Fanny. Now, upon examining Betty, her powers of mediumship were quickly dismissed, because after they looked at her knuckles, they realised that they were bruised and calloused from months of knocking and scratching on wood. It was also discovered that Betty would often hide a small piece of wood under her dress, somewhat explaining the mysterious knocks and scratches that occurred when the 11-year-old was nearby. Yet Betty insisted for quite some time that she was no fraud and that the ghost of Fanny would reveal itself to them. All they had to do was visit the crypt at St. John's where she was buried and wait for a knock on her coffin lid. The men were committed, and off they went with a very unwilling Betty in tow. The crypt was deeply unpleasant, with stacked coffins and the smell of decomposing bodies filling the air, but they stayed with intent, sure to complete their investigations. They found Fanny's coffin, knocked on the lid. Nothing. She was silent. The party stayed until the early hours, but she never appeared. And presenting their findings, the committee made one clear and final judgment, that Betty and the Cock Lane ghost were frauds. And following Samuel Johnson's damning reports, the story of the Cock Lane ghost died relatively quickly. William Kent was never officially accused of murder, but his reputation was understandably destroyed by the accusations, and he went on to prosecute the whole Parsons family and the Reverend Moore. Now, Moore paid substantial damages to Kent, totalling an enormous £300 in 1762, which approximates to around £31,000 today. And unsurprisingly, Parsons couldn't afford his side of the payout, having spent most of his seance spoils on booze, so he and his wife were charged. She was sentenced to hard labour, while Richard Parsons himself was fined £50, which is around £5,000 in today's money, and he was sent to jail for 2 years following a period of time in the pillory. Parsons would have been terrified of being in the pillory at this time, which is the stocks, as not only would one be subjected to the usual instances of rotting fruit and veg hurled your way, but being incapacitated in a public space, especially if you had turned public opinion, could result in death. Now, Parsons entered the pillory, was locked in place, and much like Fanny's body, nothing happened. He had little bother from locals. In fact, they really rather enjoyed seeing him and began to leave him little gifts, monetary gifts for that matter, so that he could maintain his gin habit while behind bars. But what became of him after this stint in jail, no one really knows. And Betty, who was arguably at the centre of this spectral circus, got away scot-free. Despite being just 11, in the 18th century, she could have been tried as an adult and faced the same penalties as her parents, but the legal system somehow skirted over here. And perhaps it was the public opinion, the same opinion that left gifts for her father, had seeped into those in authority, or perhaps she was seen as nothing more than a pawn. We can't really be sure, but we do know that Betty lived for another 50 years and would entertain neighbours by showing them exactly how she created the noises of scratching Fanny. And following his third marriage, William Kent disappeared into obscurity and didn't really make the headlines for any other matrimonial ghostly happenings. And although the Cock Lane ghost was essentially disproven, its importance in the public eye was well established, as belief in the afterlife was essential in pretty much all facets of Christian doctrine, and several preachers of differing denominations had become embroiled in this case. A debate as to the place of the supernatural in Anglican and Methodist belief systems erupted across the country. The Cock Lane ghost lived on in art and theatre for centuries as well, featuring in the works of Oliver Goldsmith and, of course, Hogarth, as we saw earlier. It was also satirically featured in works by Dickens, with Mrs. Nickleby once claiming humorously that her great-grandfather went to school with the Cock Lane ghost. Controversy and conspiracies were also associated with this case for centuries after the spirit had been put to bed. Most famously, the artist J.W. Archer went to the church where Fanny's coffin was stored nearly a century later. He was sent to produce illustrations for the book Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions, which of course contained a nod to the Cock Lane ghost. Accompanied by the sexton's boy and a lantern, the lid to the coffin of scratching Fanny was opened to reveal her perfectly preserved body. According to Archer's notes, the face was of a once handsome woman with a pronounced aquiline nose, which was surprising, as the cartilage in the nose generally disappears rather quickly in cases of smallpox. Now, reports such as Archer's really do continue to pique our modern interest, especially if we're presented with what seems to be a centuries-old murder mystery. But in reality, Archer's report is again apocryphal. It may not have actually been Fanny's body. And we know that 2 doctors alongside servants treated Fanny in her final weeks. And also, if they did test for arsenic was so abundant in day-to-day life in the 18th and 19th centuries that even if traces were found in her body, no one would be surprised. But I suppose there's always that last lingering what if. Today, Cock Lane is no more. This is Kate's tourist photos, having been demolished so frustratingly in 1979. and in its place sits a row of rather nondescript office buildings, and their haunting status is sadly, rather currently, unknown. Thank you very much for listening to my spooky waffle. And that's all my social media links and my Ko-fi and my Patreon if you want to get deeper into my mind and enjoy lots of daft spooky content on a weekly basis. But thank you very much for having me.